I love you too, but sometimes that is definitely a challenge.
Yeah.
But I think that it is working now. So cool. It'll just start in a minute on YouTube, but we are live on the other site. So hello to everyone who is joining us today, and thank you for being here. So I'm really excited today to talk about mining. It's a good time considering everything that's been going on in the crypto space, which we'll get into. But first, let's do intros. I'm Jessica Levesque. I'm the executive director at C4. And we're very lucky to be joined today by an amazing teacher, Paul Pui from Edge.
Thanks so much for having me again, Jessica. I'm glad to be able to be giving this little course on mining. It's one of the most misunderstood parts of cryptocurrency, dating as far back as when the only cryptocurrency was Bitcoin. People are like, well, I don't get it. How in the world do you mine? There's no mining involved. There's no shovels. There's no machinery. Why do we even call it mining? And so hopefully for those of you that are listening and watching, we'll finally uncover and you'll have that aha moment where you finally go, oh my God, I understand how Bitcoin and most cryptos work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is one of those things I think where when I first started learning about it, it seemed really complicated and difficult to understand. And one of the examples that I know you like to give that we'll get into, I'd heard prior to you giving it, and it took like a few times to get into. So for anyone who's watching this, if any of it seems complicated and difficult to understand, Paul, I think you do a really good job breaking it down. But for anyone that is struggling, just listen to the parts that are a challenge again. And I think if you hear it more than once, that it'll come to you and it'll be more clear, because it is complicated, right? If it was easy, then we wouldn't need to have a live stream on it. Everyone would just
Yeah,
know.
exactly. It's complicated, but admittedly, once you figure out, it's actually very elegant. And
It is.
it's one of the most unique inventions. And it is at the heart of what made Bitcoin so unique. And figuring out the fact that this mining, which does actually it has multiple purposes, you'll find that it's an amazing invention and one of the reasons why there's so many people excited about this technology.
Yeah, I think maybe we should start by talking, before we get into kind of the nuts and bolts, just talk about what the purpose of mining is. Why is this even something that we're talking about when we talk about cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin in particular?
Yeah. So in order to know the purpose of mining on Bitcoin and crypto, first you should understand what's the purpose of mining before Bitcoin. So you think about it, the one thing we think of when we think of mining in money is gold. And in gold, there was really only one purpose of mining, and it's the issuance of the currency, right? You stuck a shovel into the ground, dug it out, and boom, there was gold now that didn't exist before. Well, it existed, but it wasn't accessible, right? So now there's more accessible gold that can now be used for trade. Mining and cryptocurrency is used for that purpose, right? It has to come out of somewhere. Bitcoin has to come out of somewhere. It can't just suddenly magically appear in a bunch of people's hands. So people have to put in some work to get the Bitcoin or get the cryptocurrency. But with Bitcoin, it has a secondary purpose. And this is the part that's very elegant. The process of mining also helps secure the network. Right? It's the process that confirms transactions, that makes sure transactions aren't double spending the same block of money to two different people. It's the process that makes sure the rules by which money can be spent are being followed. It's a process that ensures the smart contracts that might be executing on various blockchains are running the exact code that a user intended. All of that kind of falls under the umbrella of securing the network, and all of that is actually part of the mining process.
So why don't we talk about why the network needs to be secured? So why are we talking about needing to secure? And maybe we should talk about a little bit about decentralized versus centralized systems and why this is something that is very different than, like, we haven't heard about mining before when we talk about like traditional banking in the same way.
Right.
So maybe you explain why there needs to be a mechanism that makes the network secure.
Well, one can think about what is the security in traditional finance, right? What is the equivalent of mining and security? Well, really, it's fairly centralized. So a bank holds a whole bunch of assets for all of its user base. And its security is making sure that when you go and say, I want to send some money from my account to your account, so from Paul's account to Jessica's account, that bank itself is saying that in our database, Paul, you have, say, $10,000, and you cannot spend more than that. If the bank doesn't keep that database secure, then in theory, someone could say, I'm going to have Paul transfer $11,000, even though he only has 10,000, and they will suddenly $11,000 will show up in your account, Jessica, even though I didn't actually have $11,000. So them keeping their database secure and making sure attackers don't come in is the security that traditional finance needs to implement so that their numbers don't go awry. All right. What now is that equivalent in cryptocurrency? Almost exactly the same thing. Like securing the network is ensuring that I, as a holder of, say, Bitcoin, cannot send out more Bitcoin than I actually have. That's the probably key, most understood aspect of quote unquote securing the network, right? You cannot double spend your funds. As well, the other part of security, which is not the kind of thing you would really credit to like an individual bank, like a Chase or a JP Morgan, like not their security, but it's actually the issuance of money. Bitcoin and all cryptos have very specific rules by which new currency can be issued. And securing the network applies to that as well, ensuring that that issuance model, that code, and that the rules by which the Bitcoin can be issued are adhered to. So that's where we create this term security of the network, which might be kind of new to people that just transact money. Like, what does it mean to secure a network? Well, it's securing those two primary things: spend only the money that you have, and as well making sure that the amount of money that's issued is per the rules that everyone has kind of agreed to for a specific crypto network.
And one of the neat things about Bitcoin and how it and why it's so revolutionary are these two things. And this is sort of what changed how money works, in that there was a way to solve this double spend problem that you were talking about, Paul, without having to have that centralized entity. There is now a way through computers to make sure that there wasn't somebody behind the scenes making sure that, you weren't sending me $11,000 and you only had 10, and then not sending somebody else $10,000. It was recorded to make sure, or it is recorded to make sure that it's not being spent twice. And we know that governments print money. There is no mechanism that just automatically creates or mints the money. It is done kind of at a whim, I guess I would say. I'm sure they would disagree with that, but it is not done based on what's going on a network.
Doesn't have the level of transparency that cryptocurrency has. Now, granted, I'll give, central banks a tiny bit of credit in the sense that it's not 100% at whim, because if they were to go ahead and 10x, 100x the money supply overnight, like very extreme, and we feel it, we do have some level of power to get those people out of the positions that they currently have. But it's so distant from us. So many of us would have to realize it, be affected, vote the right people into power to be able to change it. It's just a very, very, very slow process. But there is some checks and balances. And in a way that still somewhat mirrors cryptocurrency, where the miners are the ones that help enforce the security in these rules, but not everybody mines. Right. So
what is mining? Maybe we should do that too.
Yeah. What exactly is mining?
Finish your thought, and then let's explain what we're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. So the miners are the ones that definitely contribute to this security of the network. Now, how do they do that? Let's break apart first the two aspects of mining, from the security of the network to the issuance of currency. Let's start with the issuance of currency. Like, how is mining issue currency out to the general public where there at first was none? So mining has a great analogy to actual physical mining. We'll call this digital mining, or digital currency mining has a great analogy to physical mining, in that it requires people to put in some amount of energy or work. And the more work you put in, the more reward you get. So if you have a plastic spoon and you try to dig up gold, you have a very, very low likelihood of getting any gold. Right? If you have a hand shovel, you still probably won't have a very good chance. If you have a regular full shovel and you happen to be at the right place at the right time, you might actually find a little bit of gold, right? If you've got earth moving tractors that also have, sonar sensors that can, detect where gold is 100 feet into the ground, which costs a lot of money. And if you think about it, money is energy. Energy is money. Time is money. You've heard those terms. They're all somewhat interchangeable in some way, shape, or form. So you spend more time digging, you spend more money with more expensive machines digging, you'll be rewarded with more gold. Really what Bitcoin tried to do when it was invented in 2008 with the original white paper, 2009 on the network, was it tried to mirror those exact same properties as gold. You put in more work, you're going to get more money. How did it effectively start off? So instead of, you obviously can't dig Bitcoin, but you can put in work. So what Bitcoin has people do is run computers and processing power to solve a puzzle. And the more computers you have, the faster computers you have, the more expensive computers you have, the faster you're going to solve the puzzle, and the more money you'll be rewarded. Now, what exactly is the puzzle? Before going exactly what is the puzzle, I'll say, what is the puzzle similar to? And once again, I'll have to give credit to what's his official position? Founder, managing director of C4, Andreas Antonopoulos.
He's a board member.
Board member. Okay, board member. Andreas, as a board member, came up with this analogy of a Sudoku puzzle, but it really applies to a lot of puzzles like crossword puzzles and whatnot. And so puzzles in general, such as Sudoku or a crossword puzzle, are generally speaking difficult to solve, but they're easy to verify, right? They have numbers that start the puzzle, and then they have numbers that you need to fill in to solve. So you can think of mining as solving a puzzle. You're given a set of starting numbers or letters in the case of a crossword puzzle, and you have to find out how to fill in the blanks. And really, you are in a race. You as a miner are in a race with everyone else that is also mining. Not unlike people digging for gold. You're kind of in a race to find the gold before someone else does. If you find it, you get it. Someone else does, they get it. The more machines, the bigger machines you have, the faster you can get it. It's this race. If there were, for example, 100 people in a room, say there's 100 people, hopefully there's 1,000 people that are listening to this, but say there's 100 people listening to this and all of us were mining, we would have the equivalent of a little Sudoku puzzle that we receive from the network, and it says, please solve this. We would all try to solve it as fast as we can. And as soon as somebody solves it, raise your hand and say, I've solved the puzzle. You distribute the answer across all of the other miners, all the other people in the room, and they can quickly verify it. And if they verify it and say, yep, Paul, you did solve the puzzle, then they, in their own little scorecard, credit me, Paul, with some Bitcoin. So we have a distributed ledger. Well, it's a distributed scorecard. You can think of it as a distributed scorecard. We each keep track of who wins some Bitcoin. And then you start working on the next puzzle. Now, admittedly, because I solved the puzzle, I will start working on the next puzzle immediately while everyone is still kind of checking, right? And you repeat that over and over again. And much like gold, if you think about it, gold thousands of years ago was really easy to find. It was kind of like sitting on top of the ground. You can walk around and go, oh, there's a piece of gold, pick it up. It was really easy to mine. As people got the easy gold to mine, it had to become harder and harder and harder. And now you needed not just a plastic spoon, you needed a real shovel and a bigger shovel, and now you needed machinery. So how does Bitcoin mirror this? How does it make it more difficult to mine? Simple. It makes the puzzle harder. So you've probably seen like small little Sudoku puzzles that are maybe like a 3x3 or 4x4. And you've seen these giant ones, right? Or giant crossword puzzles. They're generally harder to solve. So what the Bitcoin network does, and very similar to other networks, is it times how long it takes for people to solve the puzzle. How long does the entire network take to solve the puzzle? And in the case of Bitcoin, it wants the network to solve the puzzle once every 10 minutes, exactly once every 10 minutes. If people start solving it faster than that, an answer shows up every 9 minutes, every 8 minutes, then the next time around, it starts increasing the size of the puzzle. If people are taking too long to solve it, 11, 12, 13 minutes, then it starts reducing the size of the puzzle, making it easier to solve. That's one way that it regulates the difficulty, but then it also reduces how much you win. So in that same sense, when you had, say, a 6-foot shovel and you're digging for gold in the early days, the average person would get, maybe an ounce of gold every, say, day. I'm just making up a number here. But as all of the gold that was easy to mine got dug up, now you had to mine for several days, or you had to use 2 shovels and 2 people to get the same amount of gold. So the network does the same thing. It's called the halving, or the halvening for some people. They like to put a little bit of lore to it. In the case of Bitcoin, roughly every 4 years, the amount of Bitcoin that you earn from mining gets cut in half. In other networks, it could be literally every few minutes, every few seconds, it regulates. In the case of Bitcoin, I like using Bitcoin as the reference point because everything is kind of based on it. It's every 10 minutes and every 4 years. Every 10 minutes, it wants a network to find a little bit of Bitcoin, basically solve a block. And then every 4 years, it adjusts to have the amount of coin that is issued out onto the network.
Somebody just asked a question in the
Sure.
chat, which I'm going to get to in just 1 second. But I did want to say first, I really like the spoon shovel analogy there, and comparing it to gold, because I feel like that really makes sense in terms of it's the tools that you're using,
The
right? Like
tools.
you could have the same people right next to each other in the same spot, but depending on the tool that they have that can complete the work,
Exactly.
it's going to be a very different outcome. So that
And
was great. I appreciate that.
and the more powerful tools generally cost more. And so you're putting more money into
Yeah.
mining gold. You'll be more successful. Same with Bitcoin.
Yeah, exactly. A plastic spoon you can grab anywhere. A really good shovel is going to cost you some money.
Exactly.
Okay, the
It's a question.
question is the nonce, number of leading zeros, of the answer that makes mining harder? So is the nonce of the answer what makes mining harder?
So this question is jumping well ahead into us
Yeah.
breaking the analogy where it's no longer the analogy of like a Sudoku puzzle. And now
So we
it's
can
what
wait
is
and
mine
get
actually?
to it.
Yeah, I think we should. So we're definitely going to make sure we answer that question to that listener. We'll definitely get to that once we start going into what actually is mining.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, cool. So hopefully that kind of answers the question of what exactly is, or how exactly is Bitcoin issuing out new currency into the network, and then with the analogy of specifically a Sudoku puzzle.
I think it does. I think it made a lot of sense. If anyone has a question specifically on that portion, please put that in the chat.
Okay.
Otherwise, we can keep going.
All right,
we also
so
might want to talk a little bit. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, next thing is we'll dive into a little bit about cryptographic hashes, which helps people understand that next phase, which is, well, what exactly is Bitcoin doing? As opposed, it's not really doing a Sudoku puzzle, it's doing these cryptographic hashes. And that will help answer the question that was asked: is this, what's this nonce thing? What does it mean? Is it, I like using the word, is it nonsense or not? Is it real? Yes.
I've never heard that
I'll
before.
say this, it's not nonsense. It's actually important.
I was just thinking of a joke in my head about, well, we're not talking about hash browns, but this is just as fun. It's like, I don't know, delicious. I can't help it coming to that. Yeah. So, all right, let's hear about hash functions.
Got it. Okay. So in trying to describe what is Bitcoin actually doing when it mines, you first have to understand a little bit of cryptography. And you'll hear a lot of terms in cryptography. I want people listening, if you're non-technical, to understand that there's 3 basic primitives of cryptography. Let's call it 3 basic primitives before the advent of a lot of this magical cryptography we call like zero knowledge proofs. I'm not an expert on zero knowledge proofs, so don't ask me too much about that. But the 3 main primitives of cryptography are public and private key signatures. Right. And Bitcoin does use that. It uses public and private key signatures. We'll talk about that later. It doesn't use, but a key part that a lot of people have utilized is encryption, symmetric key encryption, where you take a key and you take some data, you encrypt that data with a key. Now, in order for you to look at that data in its original form, you need that same key to decrypt it. All right. So that's standard encryption. Most people, when they think of cryptography, they think of encryption, but they don't realize there's other primitives other than just encryption. Bitcoin does not use any encryption, actually. And that's one of the most widely misunderstood pieces. There's no encryption in Bitcoin, but there is cryptography. The third primitive of cryptography is a cryptographic hash function. And this is what we're going to talk about and how it applies to mining. So a cryptographic hash function is basically a way to get a fingerprint of data, a very unique fingerprint given some input data. So an input data can be small, it can be large, it could be a book, a digital version of a book. It can be a video, a photo, it could be just a sentence. And you pass it through this cryptographic hash function and a stream of data comes out on the other side. Now, that doesn't tell you much. Okay, so a stream of data comes out the other side. But what's unique about a cryptographic hash function? You can think of it as a one-way fingerprint, such that if you have the exact same data will always produce the exact same fingerprint on the other side. But you cannot reverse it. If you have the fingerprint, there's no way to generate the data that started from. That's an important thing. It's like an irreversible language translator. So I know English and I needed to get translated to German. Well, I go use Google Translate it. I speak the English and suddenly the German comes out, but somehow you can't go in reverse. That's one way to think about it, but it always has a perfect translation from one way to the other. These are like digital numerical versions of a translator, but it's only one way. You can't go in reverse. And you can't even predict what it will look like when you do the translation until you do it. So given that book and that video, you have no idea what the fingerprint looks like until you pass it through the hash function. You just have to. And that output data looks completely random. It doesn't have any similarity to the input data. So when you pass a photo through it, all right, say it's a photo of me right now. I pass it through the hash function. It's not like the photo is going to suddenly come out the other way with me just blinking an eye. No, it'll look like complete gibberish, but it'll always look like the exact same gibberish for that exact same photo. Okay, so that's a cryptographic hash function. So now how do we actually use a cryptographic hash function in proof of work? So in proof of work, or in Sudoku, you have starting numbers that start the puzzle. Same thing in the real hashing algorithm. There's amount of data that starts the puzzle. And the goal of the miner is to add on a little bit of data to that. So let's take the analogy of say it's a sentence, right? The starting data is just a sentence. You know, what's the common one? The brown fox jumped over the lazy dog, or lazy fox jumped over a lazy dog. So there's a starting sentence.
Something like that, yeah.
Something like that. You pass it through the hash function and you just get a random string of data, which in computers is nothing but the zeros and ones, which can then obviously be represented as a number, right? All data can be represented as a number. So you get the string of data, let's just call it, it turns into this big number. Your goal as a miner is to add a word to that sentence, all right? Big brown fox jumped over, blah, blah, blah. You add another word at the end, any word you want. Like could be the word silly. You add that word and you pass it to the hash function. Now a completely different string of data comes out the other end. That string of data can be represented as a number. You need to find the word that you can attach to the sentence that generates a number less than a certain value. And this is that nonce question that this user had. That little data you add to the sentence is called a nonce, right? You can stick whatever data you want there, whatever word you want, out comes a number. Now the network will ask, what's the value of that number? And is it less than a certain number, a certain value? Where does that certain value come from? Well, that's actually the difficulty. If the range of numbers that can come out of this hash function, let's limit the range to 4 billion. All right, that's a 32-bit number. So say it's 0 to 4 billion. If the difficulty is 3 billion, then you have a 75% chance, right, of generating a hashed value that is less than the difficulty of 3 billion. The lower that I reduce that number from 3 billion to 2 billion, 3 billion to 2 billion means you have a 50% chance, right? Because it's effectively a random value that comes out the other end. I keep lowering it even further, right? Instead of it being 4 billion, 3 billion, 2 billion, maybe it's 1,000. Now it's really, really, really hard to generate this hash on the other side that's less than the number 1,000, because there's 4 billion, 4 billion 4 billion possible outputs, but only 1,000 that are correct. But once I find that one, by trying a whole bunch of different words, I've effectively solved the puzzle. So the weird thing is people say, like, oh, well, how is that like Sudoku? It's similar to Sudoku if you're a monkey that just randomly throws numbers at the Sudoku puzzle. That's effectively what people are doing when they mine and try to solve this puzzle. They're not trying to actually think about, hey, what's the proper numbers I should put into this puzzle to solve it? Instead, it's let's just throw a bunch of numbers, see if it works, try it again, see if it works, try it again, see if it works until you solve it. And this is effectively what's happening.
The monkey thing, I think it's fascinating to hear you say it that way. And I think I've heard you explain it that way before, but it made me laugh because I'm terrible at Sudoku. Like it is just, so I feel like I would do just about as well as a monkey throwing numbers and trying to solve
No
it.
offense to monkeys. To all the monkeys out there that are listening. No offense to you guys. Obviously, we're a derivation of monkeys and whatnot. We make fun of like monkeys on the keyboard can code up any program on earth. But yeah, that's really it. You're just throwing numbers. Just keep throwing numbers, keep creating the hash. You hash those numbers, find out if the resulting hash is less than the difficulty number. And once again, if people start solving the puzzle too quickly, that difficulty gets lower and lower and lower and lower, where you have really tiny odds of solving it. But then that's okay, because that means that computers are so fast, they can keep trying. And really the speed of computers, people like to say, hey, the faster computer, the better you are at solving a puzzle. Really, it's not that you're better at solving the puzzle. It's better at checking whether or not your guess is correct. That's really what it is. You're not actually trying to solve it. You're just throwing in a number. How fast can you check that your guess is a correct value. And then try again and try again and try again. So you'll hear these terms like exahashes, petahashes, gigahashes. That's how many guesses you can check per second. And it's these hash functions.
And this is the number or the reason that so much work is happening, correct? And why the computers that can have more power and can do this checking more quickly are more likely to solve the block solve the puzzle and mine the block, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The faster you can throw in numbers into the Sudoku puzzle and check that it's right, the better odds you have of solving the puzzle before someone else does. But really, it's kind of a lottery. There's that 10-minute goal that Bitcoin has. There's no guarantee that it's 10 minutes. Sometimes you're just not lucky. Because you're not actually trying to solve the puzzle, you're just guessing. You just might guess wrong way longer. And we've had blocks that take hours to solve and some that take seconds to solve from the previous block. So just so you know that there's some luck necessary and odds that we're playing, much like a casino, and it really mirrors the lottery.
Yeah, so there's luck, and then there's also the benefit of having a stronger computer. Mm-hmm. And I think you'll get to this, but the difference between the types of computers that can do this. So ASICs or GPUs, I think we'll bring that up. But the types of computers that can do this have changed over time as it's become more difficult.
Absolutely. We can get into that later, but to give people a little bit of an overview, generally speaking, computers have a range from being what's called general purpose to very, very targeted and specific. And just like humans or animals and dogs, for example, they come in all different breeds. You can have a mutt that's kind of like amalgamation of all the different kinds of dogs, and it'll be able to do a little bit of everything, but it won't be great at any one thing. Same thing with computers and humans. If you focus on one thing and that's all you do, you're gonna be very good at it. But you might suck at everything else. You might be absolutely terrible at everything else. And so computers that are focused on doing nothing but mining Bitcoin are going to be amazingly good at it, very efficient, very energy efficient, but they'll be able to do nothing else. But to start off, people use general purpose computers because they were cheap and accessible, and they did a pretty good job, but they've been beaten by more targeted specific hardware. Okay, cool. So that is what real like Bitcoin miners are doing, right? That is that cryptographic hash, inserting their nonce, which is their guess, combining that with the numbers in the network and hashing and finding if the result is less than the difficulty value. That's really what is actually happening in mining. And that hash function, just for you that want the buzzwords to be able to show off at parties, it's called a SHA-256 hash. Simple as that, right? I want to drop some lingo. There you go. SHA-256 cryptographic hash. Cool.
Yeah, you can shot out it from the rooftops.
Yeah, you can shot it. Yep. You can shot it from rooftops. Cool. So go into the next thing, which is the other purpose of mining, which is securing the network. And this is the part I'm like, blows my mind. It's so elegant, has no analogy to gold mining at all. And best way to start is to think about it. When you had that Sudoku puzzle, there's these starting numbers. Well, who in the world chooses those starting numbers? Where do they come from? Right. And in the Bitcoin mining, there's actual data that starts the hash, and you insert your nonce into that data. Well, where does that data actually come from? Well, it's actually the list. It's actually the data of the transactions that want to be confirmed on the network. Right. So there's this concept called the mempool. Right. It's the memory pool. It's the pool of transactions that people broadcast to the network to send money from one person to another, but they haven't been confirmed yet. You can kind of think of it as the check that you write that the bank hasn't stamped approval on. And that might be a terrible analogy because maybe a lot of listeners have never written a check. All right. We're probably dating ourselves here, Jessica and I. But, in the old days, there's this thing called a check.
We're both like 24, right?
Yeah. Well, maybe 25 now. But yeah. So yeah, check, or in other ways too, even a credit card swipe. When you swipe a credit card, a merchant doesn't immediately get the money. It takes days before they get it. So these transactions are what people want to do, but the network hasn't confirmed them yet. The money hasn't actually transferred. They're sitting in this pool. Now, what do you do as a miner? You actually get to choose which transactions you want to include. You get to choose the starting numbers of your puzzle. It doesn't make it any easier to solve though, right? You could choose no transactions. It's still just as difficult to solve the puzzle if you have absolutely no transactions, but you do get a choice. So what miners are doing here is they're saying, I am only going to pick transactions out of this pool that are valid, meaning that the source of funds actually has that money And the destination, obviously a valid address, like it's a valid, Bitcoin address, but generally speaking, that source of funds is the most important rule you want to follow. Does that source of funds, that starting account, actually have enough money to create this transaction? If you choose an invalid transaction, then you're at risk of having all that work you do go to waste. But let's just start. We're going to pick a bunch of transactions that we think as a miner are valid. We bundle that all together, and that now becomes the start of our block, or the start of our puzzle. Now we go and do the whole mining process and try to hash and insert random nonces until we solve a block. Once we solve that block, remember how we broadcast it out to the network like the Sudoku puzzle, and everyone else verifies that I solved the puzzle correctly. I solved that Sudoku puzzle correctly. They do verify that. They make sure I solved the puzzle correctly, but they actually do a second thing. All of those nodes on the network, all those other miners, check to make sure that the transactions I chose are valid. And if I chose an invalid transaction, they say, nope, sorry, Paul, your puzzle was not solved correctly because you chose invalid starting numbers. And then I get screwed. This is actually how this network is secured. This is the elegance of Bitcoin. I, as a miner, am financially motivated only to include correct transactions, because if I include an incorrect one, then I've spent money. I spend money to mine this Bitcoin, and I don't actually get any Bitcoin in return. That really ties it all together. There's not a whole lot more other than that to understand the interconnection between mining for issuance of currency, which I'm motivated by. I want that money, but then also mining to secure the network, which I'm also motivated by as a miner. Only include valid transactions, because otherwise I can't earn that money. The two go so incredibly well together. That was one of my mind-blown moments when I first learned about Bitcoin, is how well these two pieces solve this problem of issuing currency in this more decentralized network where, there's no one person to trust, because every participant is already financially motivated to do the right thing.
So there's a question in the chat that might be relevant to talk about now.
Sure.
But the question is, how does a blockchain split actually get resolved, and after how many blocks generally? So let's talk a little bit about if there's a disagreement.
Yeah, exactly. So there's splits that just naturally happen. And then there's disagreements where different nodes are actually running software that has different rules. That's more of an intentional fork.
And I think the question was more about the unintentional.
The unintentional. Splits. Okay, so let's talk about the unintentional splits. Let's say we got those 100 people mining. Okay. And let's say I first solve one of the puzzles and I broadcast it to the network. But nearly like just a millisecond later, say Jessica solves the puzzle and broadcasts it out to the network. At some point in time, various people on the network, various other miners are going to validate my block, and then others are going to validate Jessica's block. So one might think, okay, well, that's a tie, right? Not really, because almost certainly a different number of miners are going to validate our different blocks. And one of the things I left out of this entire mining description is that the start of the network, right? I'm sorry, not the start of the network. The starting of your puzzle doesn't just include the transactions that want to be included, but it also includes a hash of the previous block. So what I've done as a miner is I've chosen whose block I want to build on top of, and that lends more credibility to that block. So if we're on block 500,000, say Jessica, you solve block 500,000, you broadcast it out to the network, I receive it, I look at it, I validate it, I say it looks good. So I'm going to want to build on top of it. Why do I want to build on top of it is the question. Why don't I want to just throw it away? I want to build on top of it because very likely other people are already building on top of it. If I choose not to build on top of it and say, Jessica, I'm not going to build on top of your block. I'm just going to continue building on top of block. I'm going to keep trying to solve block 500,000. By the time I solve it, other people might have already built 500,001. And one of the rules of the network is the longest and strongest chain wins. So this is called the longest for simplicity. And people want to follow the longest chain. And if I've only solved block 500,000 and someone has already solved block 500,001, they're in the lead. And my block now gets thrown away. So I'm motivated if I see your block to go and build on top of it, if I deem that it's valid. So let's go back to the question at hand, is what happens in a split? So in a split, two miners almost identically solve the exact same block, but there's almost no chance that that block gets broadcast to the exact same number of miners, right? And even if it did, say there was exactly 100 miners on the network, and you got your block broadcasted to 50 of them, and I got my block broadcast to another 50. And now we have 50 miners almost at the exact same time, two groups of 50 miners trying to solve the next block, but we're now in a fork, right? Block 500,000 are half Jessica's and then half on mine. Really, it's which side of the network solves the next block first. That really becomes the question. And that'll almost, it's so hard to solve a block exactly at the same time that it doesn't usually take more than another block to resolve that split. You know, because it's so hard. It's what in computer science we call a race condition. It's very hard to have the timing, and especially because Bitcoin's block times are relatively long. It's tough to have those blocks happen at the same time. So someone solves it, say on Jessica's network, that's block 500,001. It gets broadcast to all 100 miners, and some of those miners go, "Oh God, I guess Jessica was right after all. Even though I was building on Paul's block, Jessica's must have been right because now it's even longer than Paul's. I'm going to switch. I'm going to start mining on top of the 500,001 first block that was on top of Jessica's." So really it's how do these splits happen? Because miners solve blocks nearly at the same time. How do they get resolved? Is the fact that it's hard to do that over and over and over again, right? Eventually one of the blocks will be built on top of versus the other. And everyone is financially motivated to continue on that longer chain versus trying to continue their own chain, because that chain will fall off and die. No one else is financially motivated to build on that chain. Hopefully that answers the question.
Questions. No, yeah. That was great. And I feel like it now made me realize there are a couple of things I don't know the answers to that I want to know. So I want to pick your brain. Okay. So how many blocks, is there like an average number of blocks that might be when there's the split before the miners that are on that other chain come back? Like how often does that happen when, and then miners realize, and how do they realize? Like, is it in the computing code?
Okay, so how they realize I can answer the statistics, I can't. I don't usually do a lot of blockchain statistics and blockchain analysis. I'm going to guess it's not going to happen more than, it doesn't take more than one block is my guess, but please don't take my word for that. Definitely ask some other experts on that. Yeah, so I'm guessing not more than one block of split would occur before it gets resolved. Now you're asking, the second question is, how does it get resolved? Like, why do people converge onto the same chain? Was that the second piece of the question?
Yes.
So they converge because they're financially motivated, right? So let's take that example again, where you and I, Jessica, both solve the same block number, say block, let's call it 500. So I have to say 500,001. So say block 500, we both solve at the exact same time. And we broadcast that out to the network. And there's 49 other miners start building on top of your block. Right. So we solved 500, you solved 500, I solved 500. Now everybody's working on 501. Everyone's trying to work on 501, but it's a different 501, a 501 built on yours and a 501 built on mine. Someone solves block 501 built on yours. Okay. They broadcast it out to the entire network. So what happens to all the people that were building on top of my 500, my block 500? Like, what they effectively say is, I'm now behind. If I solve block 501, I'm behind because someone else has already solved block 501, and they did it on a different block 500 on, we'll call it 500J, which is Jessica's versus 500P, Paul. All right, so 500J already had block 501 solved. So even though I was trying to find 501 on top of Paul's 500P, I'm behind. I need to hop on the J train, right, in order to stay onto the leading chain, the longest chain, because that's what everyone is motivated to do by the code. The code says, I want to be on the longest chain, because if I don't, I'm a different chain completely. I'm a completely different chain that disagrees with everyone else, and I'm no longer Bitcoin. Right now, I'm a fork of Bitcoin. So it is still that financial motivation. Like, you don't want to create another currency. And if you did, then that's an intentional split. That's an intentional fork. Unintentionally, you don't want to unintentionally create a split because you've now decreased the value of the coins that you have. So that's really it. Once again, all boils down to financial motivation.
And also, if you're listening and you're like, fork, yeah, I want to know more about forks, then you should check out our CDP prep course, in which we go much more in detail about what happens in forking. So
Yep.
Check that out. And
cool.
Go ahead, continue, Paul.
Okay, so that is really the description of mining in general. There's not much more, hopefully, to understand. If there's any questions, definitely please feel free to holler, raise a hand, or whatnot. But there's not a whole lot more to understand the basics of how money is issued on the Bitcoin network and other similar chains, and then how that issuance of money secures the network. And really, you've understood now all the way down to the actual protocol, as opposed to just the analogies. And what we can talk about now are really some derivations of that, such as, what are the different hashing algorithms? It gets a little bit more technical, and some of the benefits of other hashing algorithms. And we'll talk about what you mentioned early on is the hardware used for mining. All right. So starting off with hashing algorithms, I gave you guys the buzzword soup that you guys, the keywords that you can SHA from the top of a rooftop, the SHA-256 hashing algorithm. And that's commonly used primarily by Bitcoin. Almost no other currencies use that. Very few other ones, Bitcoin Cash, Bitcoin SV, but by and large, it's mainly Bitcoin that uses the SHA-256 algorithm. Now, one of the traits of the SHA-256 algorithm is that it requires a lot of CPU power, right? It requires a lot of computing power to be fast and efficient, but it does not require a lot of memory. So when you buy a computer, there's different specs. There's three main specs when you buy a computer. It's the CPU speed, right? It's actually in a way four. CPU speed and a number of CPUs. Like, is it 2-core, 4-core, 8-core, 16 cores, which really is how many brains does the computer have? And then how fast is each brain? The second spec is how much memory is in the computer. And for all of you that like to have your browser tab parties with like 50 tabs, every tab takes up some amount of memory, right? And once you have way too many tabs, or all doing a bunch of things, your computer starts to slow down really bad, if not crash. So that's just memory. And the last thing is like your hard drive storage. Like, how much storage do you have? You got 1 terabyte, 2 terabytes, 4 terabytes, whatnot. That's like the long-term memory when you turn off the computer and restart it. Okay. So those are the three main specs of a computer. The SHA-256 hashing algorithm is really intense on the CPU, but it's not intense on memory. So other coins such as Litecoin and Ethereum, before its merged or it went to proof of stake, they used a different algorithm called Scrypt, or other similar algorithms to that. And what that did is it added another layer of complexity or difficulty in that it was memory intensive. As the puzzles got harder, you needed not just faster computers, you needed computers with more memory that could remember larger amounts of data. And really what their attempt was they wanted mining to be restricted to general purpose computers that you and I would buy, off the shelf, and try to restrict access to very, very specific ASICs. So those ASICs we'll talk about later, but computers that can only do mining, because those have very little memory. Memory is very expensive. Compute in general is much cheaper. So algorithms such as Scrypt and other derivations try to create this trade-off where memory is what we need as opposed to CPU. And that really is to do what they believe is decentralization of mining, right? How is that achieved? Well, let's talk about the actual mining hardware. So we talked about this a bit earlier, general purpose computers all the way to very specific. There's three main levels of computers or types of computing used to mine. One is general purpose, your laptop, your desktop, tower, cloud computing. Second are what are called GPUs, which are graphic processing units, your video game cards that can render all those pretty pixels for video games. They're also really, really good at mining certain mining algorithms. So they're a little bit more specific, right? They're not as general purpose as a CPU. They're a little bit more specific, but they're are called massively parallel, where you might have 8 brains or 8 cores or 4 cores on your general computer that you buy, your MacBook, your Windows computer. These GPUs have thousands of brains, but each one is tiny. right? Think of thousands of tiny, slow brains, but thousands of them versus 8 really fast ones. And because mining Bitcoin requires a very simple process, like that hashing algorithm is really simple. It's not super complicated. You can put that on a tiny, simple brain. And it's nice to have 1,000 of them because now you can take thousands of guesses at a time as opposed to 1 or 4 guesses at a time. And then there's ASICs, which are chips custom designed to do absolutely nothing more than that SHA-256 algorithm and nothing else. You can't run a program on it. It's as dumb as it gets for doing just one thing. But they're incredibly fast, incredibly efficient, very much more power efficient. And they're generally only built for the hashing algorithms for the most popular coins, such as Bitcoin. Right? The problem, so what's the trade-off? The problem with that is once you start getting hardware that's very, very specific, I'm going to start delving into some ideology that's very debatable, right? This is not like cold, concrete fact, but much more debatable. Once you need
Sounds
hardware,
interesting.
yeah. So this is where you start getting into the tug of war battles on Twitter. Yeah. But once you start requiring hardware, or once you make available hardware that's very specific to a specific use case, now miners that have access to that specific hardware have an advantage. So a lot of chips, ASICs, are built in China, as an example. Like China was, to some degree still is, the chip manufacturing giant of the world. So if you could get access to these very, very specific, rarely made, barely made chips versus everyone else in the world, you have a core advantage. If you're a manufacturer of these specific chips, like you actually build the chip, you design the chip, you build the chip, you're at a core advantage. You can use it for, say, 3 months and then sell it to everyone else while you're using the latest and greatest chip. And since you're faster, cheaper, you're mining way better than everyone else. You have the biggest shovel, right? You got the biggest shovel, you got the biggest earth mover before anyone else has it. And once it's obsolete, you sell it and then you move on to the latest earth mover. So the problem with that is it isolates the most successful miners to a smaller percentage of the population. And this is the reason why some currencies, some blockchains, try to prevent that. They want people to be able to mine with general purpose computers. And they do that by creating a hashing algorithm that is very expensive to implement with an ASIC, such as scrypt, which requires a lot of memory. So therefore, you just use regular computers, which have a lot of memory. But there's other trade-offs in that regard as well, which could be possibly a whole nother topic of conversation. Just know there is this breadth of options within the mining hardware suite of choice. And Bitcoin, being one of the biggest, it definitely has ASICs. Don't try to mine Bitcoin with a computer. You won't find a block. Almost, you'll just lose money on electricity and energy. Cool.
Yeah, that's a good tip for anyone who's thinking about doing so. You can't just pull your laptop out and
not anymore.
Start to get rich. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Well, we only have a few minutes left. Is there anything else specifically you wanted to bring up beforehand? I did want to point out, anyone that's listening that's wondering about the energy consumption side of things. I know, Paul, you talked about it a little bit, but we have a live stream tomorrow with our Certified Bitcoin Professional Committee, and we're going to be talking about Bitcoin myths and facts, and we'll be getting into some more details about energy consumption in that. So it's tomorrow at 12 Eastern. So that would be Thursday, October 6th. So please join us for that. And if you're watching this video later, check that out on our YouTube channel.
Yeah, probably the one thing that I'll end with is kind of the competitive advantage to mining. And I hate to say this, but likely this is to discourage most people from even trying to mine, because there's 3 main competitive advantages that you need in order to be successful in mining. Because remember, this is a race. It's a competition, right? You're competing against everyone else that can mine. And the 3 things are, number 1, energy, access to really, really cheap electricity. If you're not rubbing the right elbows with the right energy producers to get cheap electricity, then you're at a core disadvantage because mining does require electricity. Number 2, cooling. Being able to cool mining hardware is key because these are computers. They run hot. The faster you run them, the hotter they get. The more you have of them, the hotter they get. So you need to have access to cheap cooling, which if you don't live in an area that is generally cold, that's going to be at a core disadvantage. If you live in an area that's hot, that's tough. And the last is what I mentioned earlier, especially for Bitcoin, is you need to have access to cheap chips whatever chips are required for mining. If it's these custom ASICs for Bitcoin, or it's these graphics cards, GPUs for other currencies like what Ethereum was using. You need to have access to that. And a lot of times those are business dealings. Those are you being very close to the original manufacturers, as opposed to literally going to your electronic shop and trying to buy one of these cards off the shelf. You're already 3 or 4 middlemen down the road, higher in price than a true professional miner that buys these things in bulk right out of the factory. And know that professional miners in cryptocurrency have all 3 competitive advantages. They have probably top 1% in low cost energy. They're putting their miners in remote locations that have access to very cool weather, in order to cool this energy. And then they are right with the manufacturers, wine and dining them in order to get access to cheap ASICs or cheap chips. And that's how they're able to be very successful in mining. Otherwise, you're at a core disadvantage and you're effectively losing money, which is what their in your loss is their gain.
It's a good way to explain that. Anything else we've only got a few minutes left. Anything else you feel like you wanted to clarify, Paul, or you wanted to mention that you'll be talking about at another time, because we're going to continue to do some of these other live streams. So if you have anything else, add it in now. Otherwise, we'll start to wrap up.
I think that is it. So if anything, I'd love to always hear from the community. If you do have any questions about what I mentioned, feel free to send me a tweet or a DM on Twitter. I'm at Paulinator, PAULLINATOR. You can find all my contact information on our website, edge.app, which you cannot mine on, unfortunately. We're self-custody app to buy, sell, and trade. But happy to answer any questions online as well. So feel free to chime in. Let me know if you need any clarification. And we will be doing a few more of these sessions on other topics. I don't recall what they're on, so definitely just keep an eye out. Subscribe to the newsletter for C4, and you'll get first word.
And your contact info for Twitter and Edge is in the description of the video as well. And then also, I thought it might be right before we close, you said a little bit about what Edge does, but you're wearing your Edge shirt. And one of the reasons that C4, that we are working with Paul to bring educational content, is because Edge also does educational content. And it's super important to Paul and the team to make sure that correct, accurate information is getting out to people that are in the community that want to learn, which is why Paul has spoken at our conference before, and RJ, who's also at Edge, is doing educational content as well. But Edge has something called education and like education, and you guys have content on edge.app as well if you go there to learn more. So maybe you want to explain a little bit about what Edge does, because I think that you do more than one thing. The app is cool, but also you do education, but maybe you just want to explain a little bit for anyone listening.
So our app overall is a self-custody app. You hold your own keys, you control your own funds, a self-custody app that lets people buy, sell, and trade dozens of different cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, ETH, various tokens. We're big on privacy. The app itself and our company never collects any personal information, although you might have to provide some to one of our third-party exchange partners. And then we access directly various DeFi protocols to let people earn yield and borrow and loan. So that's what the app effectively does. Our company, though, has a strong ethos around community. So we host dozens of different meetups at our office here in San Diego. If you happen to be in the area, definitely check out our website, edge.app/events. We'll show you the different meetup groups and different events happening. We have one coming this Thursday, one in a couple of weeks. We have great projects like ThorChain and BitRefill speaking at these meetup groups. And that's our way of educating the community, in addition to our education blog posts, which just give people updates on the cryptocurrency space, both through newsletter as well as blog posts. And we're just trying to get the word out there. So hopefully that gives a little summary of both who we are as a product, but also who we are as people in the company and what our mission is.
Yeah. And I mean, you volunteer your time to be here today to talk about it. So I feel like that kind of says a lot about your company and what you guys believe in. And also for those people who are interested in going to one of these meetups, you can just look behind Paul at the amazing view that is not behind me and see why maybe you'd want to go there. Yeah, that is not a stock image. So
no, it's not Zoom. It's real
gorgeous
people. Yep. Love it over here in San Diego. So definitely swing on by. We've got great people speaking. Cool.
Very cool. Well, Paul, thank you so much. Thank everyone for watching, and we will see you another time. Take care.
Take care. See you, everyone.